21mm socket, remove all 6 of your lug nuts, and then take the wheel off. I'm going to remove the cotter pin, and if yours is very rusty, then you might have to just cut it. There we go. And now with your 19mm socket, remove this castle nut. And looks like my tie rod came out of the knuckle right away, but if not, what you would want to do is take your hammer right here on the edge of the knuckle, and that should break the tie rod free from the knuckle. But again, in my case, this popped off, so that's perfect. Now that that's off, just install the nut on here, a couple threads to hold it, and now let's break the jam nut free. To break the jam nut free, I'm going to use a 22mm wrench. These can be on here pretty tight, so some rust penetrant and heat can help. Now that this is broken free, let's continue by removing the outer tie rod completely. So the way I want to do this is count the amount of turns that it takes to take this off, so that when you reinstall, you can put it on the same amount of turns and it'll match up almost the same. It's not going to get you a perfect alignment this way. You still need a professional alignment, but this will get you as close as possible. Okay, so I had about 14.5 turns. With a 12mm, I'm going to remove this skid shield. Take the 2 bolts out. I just think it's going to make it a lot easier to access the inner tie rod. Okay, this is going to drop down and it has 2 little hooks on the front that hook into the frame. So I'm going to lock some locking pliers onto the inner tie rod because I need to remove this nut so we can pull this boot off. And it's kind of rusty, so hopefully it comes off. 22mm socket. So as you can see, my nut doesn't really want to come off easily, so I'm going to take a little torch and heat it up. With some needle nose pliers, I'm going to grab onto this clamp and remove it. Make sure the boot spins freely, it's not seized on here, which it's not. Now we have to remove the inner clamp. So right here on the inside, you'll see a clamp. You can either pry it off from the bottom and just try to break it. Basically, this is a single-use clamp. And if that doesn't work, I'm going to use a hammer with a long pry bar and basically just knock it off of there. There we go. That's what I wanted to do. Now that it's broken off, you can just remove it. And of course, like I said, this is a single-use clamp. Now you can pull the bellows boot off the rack and pull it off of your tie rod end. Now, if you're reusing this boot, you want to inspect it and make sure it's not cracked or broken anywhere here where it's going to allow moisture to get in. This one's perfectly fine. I'm replacing mine, but if you're reusing it, then of course inspect it and make sure it's good. Now on the top here, you'll see a little flat washer that's bent, peened over. You want to unbend that, and that's what locks in this inner tie rod. So use a pry bar and a hammer and just kind of bend it the opposite way. Should be the same on the bottom. I'm going to use this special tie rod remover tool, or inner tie rod remover tool. They make other types, but this is the one I have. And the way it works is I'm going to clamp it on to this piece of the tie rod, and I'm going to make sure it's nice and snug. Basically, I want it to bite into the tie rod here and lock on. And then I'm going to take my ratchet with a 3/8 adapter in there and spin this counterclockwise, and that should break it free. Perfect. That's exactly what I wanted. That broke free. Now you can just spin this off the rest of the way. Before this actually fully comes off, I'm going to remove my tool just because it's easier to do it here while it's still attached. Okay, slide this off. Now take off your tie rod end. And when it comes off, make sure it comes off with this little washer. You should have a new one. Typically, you don't want to reuse these. Go ahead and clean out this area just a little bit where the threads are, just to make sure there's no debris or even grease in there. You want the threads to lock on properly. And then when you put on the new tie rod, make sure it has this brand new washer on here. And if you can see these little tabs here, they actually need to go and lock into these two cutouts. So as you thread it on, don't worry about it at first, but then as it gets closer to being bottomed out, I like to take this washer and find the area where this locks in. Oh, right there, it fell in place. I'm gonna hold it there and thread the tie rod on the rest of the way. You want this to stay locked into those grooves. That way it can't spin when the washer is peened over and locked on. All right, perfect. Now let's get the tool and tighten it. So slide this on and tighten it up. Okay, make sure that's nice and snug. And now let's make the tie rod tight. Now you don't want to go crazy tight on this because you don't want to twist the internals of the steering rack, but you want to make it tight enough to where it's not going to come off, of course. So what I did is I went about 1/8 of a turn after it bottomed out. That's nice and snug. So let's take this tool off. All right, and now we have to bend over this washer up top and on the bottom to lock in the inner tie rod. All right, just do your best to try to lock it in. And for the bottom one, I'm gonna push the tie rod back out. All right, it's locked in. Your inner tie rod should have come with this little packet of grease. You can add about 90% of it in here. And the reason I say 90%, not all of it, is because the last bit of it I like to add right here where this cutout is, and that's where the boot rides. And if you do this, it's going to actually prevent that rubber from sticking onto the tie rod. So when you have your alignment professional align the vehicle and they twist the tie rod, it's not going to twist and rip this boot off. It's going to slide easily on the grease. So put most of it in here and just work it in a little bit. This is going to prevent the joint from wearing out prematurely, and it's going to prevent rust from building up. And now I'm going to take my boot, and with a wire tie, I'm going to secure the boot on the inner part of it, or you can use another one of those single-use clamps, but you need a special tool for that. I'm going to start this wire tie on here, that way when I put it on, it's not going to take too much effort to secure it. Slide this on all the way. All right, so fully seated on the power steering rack up here. Make sure that it's completely engaged. You want to take that wire tie and tighten it up as much as you can. I like to use cutters and gently grab on and twist it. And then once you feel that it's tight enough, cut off the excess. That's perfect. You want to make sure that this makes a nice watertight seal up here. Now for this clamp, I'm not going to reuse my original one. I'm going to actually use a wire tie to secure it. If your outer clamp is weak, you can do the same thing. That way it can seal up properly. So grab this with some cutters, tighten it up, and cut off the excess. Perfect. Before I drive my nut on here, the jam nut, I'm going to put some anti-seize on the threads. That way the outer tie rod and the nut won't seize up in the future. Now when you put on the outer tie rod, you want to put it on the same amount of turns that you counted to take it off. So for me it was about 14.5 turns, so that's how much I'm going to count to put it on. Okay, so 14.5 gets me to the tie rod being upside down, so I'm just going to go 15, leave it at this, and now let's start this into the knuckle. Perfect. Put on your castle nut, and let's bottom this out, make it nice and tight. The new size is a 21 millimeter. Okay, now that it's bottomed out, let's torque it. Torque this to 67 foot-pounds. And now you want to look at the little castle slots in the castle nut. You want to make sure it lines up with the hole for the cotter pin. If it does not, like mine doesn't, you want to always tighten, not loosen, to make it line up. So go over to the nearest slot, which is right there. Put in my cotter pin and bend it over to lock it in. Perfect. Last thing to do is to lock this on. Make sure that's nice and snug, and then once you're done, move it back so that the tie rod isn't sitting at an angle. You want to make sure it's basically parallel with the knuckle. Go ahead and reinstall this shield. It has 2 hooks on the front. Once they hook on, you can bring it up, start in the 2 bolts, and snug them up. Perfect. Go ahead and reinstall the wheel. Start on all 6 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and then torque them to 83 foot-pounds. 83 foot-pounds.